A death wish always comes true.
Hey everyone, welcome to Let's Talk. My name is John, and today we're here to talk about the 1974 action thriller Death Wish and its brand new 4K Blu-ray from Kino Lorber. But before we dive into that, if you are a fan of 4K Blu-ray reviews, movie reviews, some tech and game reviews along the way, nothing would help the channel out more than by you liking this video and subscribing to the channel. So 1974's Death Wish is directed by Michael Winner and stars one of the most famous actors of the 1960s and 1970s, Charles Bronson, who I'll always know from Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, where he is just fantastic in that.
Looks like we're shy of one horse.
You brought too many.
And this is actually my first time ever seeing Death Wish, and I know it's got a bunch of sequels and a remake starring Bruce Willis, but I just never caught up to this film. I was pleasantly surprised. I enjoyed this film. I didn't love this film. I didn't think that this was an all-time classic film, a film from the 70s that I'm always going to go back and revisit. The 70s was filled with some all-time classics like the Godfather movies, Apocalypse Now, The French Connection, which was probably more in line with this, Shaft. There's also a bunch of 1970s films that take place in New York that deal with the grittiness and the crime that was going on in New York. Like I said, Shaft is one of those films, The French Connection, and then this. And the crime rate in the 1970s in New York was so high that one of the big things with film is that it reflects how the world is at the time. And this movie is showing that in the 1970s, New York was just beaten down, bruised. They were just overwhelmed with crime. The cops couldn't handle it. And what would they do if they made a movie, or in this case, it's based on a book from 1972 of the same name, where a man who happens to have his wife killed and his daughter raped, a man who's very passive-aggressive. He was a conscientious objector in the Korean War. He doesn't use guns. Back in the 1970s, he would be considered very liberal. He's not an aggressive man. He's an architect, and he's just going about living his life. But what would happen if his whole life got flipped upside down and he gets just a new look at it? His wife gets murdered, his daughter gets violently raped, and he's just not the same person anymore. And he feels like the cops are not doing enough to solve this crime or to solve the whole crime rate of the city. They're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing, given that they show that in this movie that they are just very overwhelmed, understaffed, and because this is just happening too frequently, there's nothing they can do. So Charles Bronson's character of Paul, who is an architect, takes it upon himself one day because he goes out to Arizona, and the guy who really likes his work, he gives him a gun as a gift. It's a .357 Magnum, I believe, and he takes this back home with him, and he decides, I'm going to start carrying this around, and if anyone crosses me, well, I'm going to blow him away. Him and that pencil-thin mustache that he's working with. Which I guess we were a little bit ahead of the 1980s thick porn stashes we would eventually get. But, I feel like back then, a thicker mustache would have worked. And that's basically what this movie is about, is just Charles Bronson's revenge tale. Getting back at the city and these muggers who took away his life. And this movie is also filled with a lot of other actors, all of which I don't think are acting on the same level as Charles Bronson. I think Charles Bronson is the best actor in this movie by far. This movie actually has a lot of actors who are in their first or very early roles. Actually, Jeff Goldblum, this is his first on-screen role. He's actually one of the muggers who ends up raping Charles Bronson's daughter in a very graphic scene, by the way, especially for 1974. I know in the 1970s we were coming off the Hays Code and they were really trying to push it, but this is a scene that would be uncomfortable in today's world, and this is almost 50 years ago. So Jeff Goldblum's in there, and then at the very end of the movie we get a very young Christopher Guest as a patrolman. And I didn't even realize that until I was looking at the Wikipedia and going down the cast list, and I was like, that can't be the same Christopher Guest, can it? And it really was, and I was like, oh my god. But I guess everyone's got to start somewhere. I knew Jeff Goldblum right away because his eyes just stick out in the crowd, but I did not know that was Christopher Guest. And then everyone else in this movie, a lot of it, like the doctor early in the movie, there's a doctor later in the movie, some of the patrolmen throughout, they all just feel like they're very generic, reading lines, just nothing there to their characters, and they're all in pretty small roles, but even his son-in-law, he's kind of like a doof in a way, he's just kind of like, whatever, I don't understand what's going on, and it's just like, your mother-in-law got killed, your wife was raped, and she's a vegetable now. I feel like you should have a little bit more emotion. And given Charles Bronson's character doesn't have that much emotion either, he just always has this still angry look on his face, which is kind of strange because he's supposed to be playing this, in the very beginning at least, like this warm-hearted man. And we see him on the beach at the very opening of this movie with his wife. And I'm just like, I'm not buying their love. And they're really trying to sell it throughout, but Charles Bronson's just not one of those actors, I think, that could really show emotion that well. He's always keeping it stoic behind those eyes. And he does a good job with that here. That's definitely his kind of emotional trait. And I guess for the 1970s, it's definitely shown throughout this movie that, men back then they didn't show their emotion. They kept it bottled up. So I guess Charles Bronson's definitely more in line with how people were in the 1970s. And I guess he does a good job carrying that. It just feels so different going back to it now to how the world was back in the 1970s. But just throughout this movie, I just didn't think the acting was perfect. Now, the actual cinematography of this movie, I thought was great. I thought they did a great job shooting this film. They're moving the camera around a lot. They're putting it in some pretty unique places. New York City in the 1970s, snow's on the ground. There's an early scene at a funeral where it's snowing out. It just looked beautiful. Like, really showing what New York City looked like in the 1970s. And I'm always a sucker for that when we see that on screen because I am from New York, and just seeing that cold weather feel, if they can really capture that perfectly, what New York feels like in the snow, I'm always going to be like, okay, you know what? They nailed that. And they really did in this. They did a great job with the cinematography. The score, on the other hand, I was just not a fan. It's a very piano-heavy score, and it just doesn't fit the tone of the movie. It doesn't feel very dark. It actually feels a little too upbeat for what's going on. And a lot of this feels like that 1970s kind of tone to it. And it just feels way too upbeat for what this movie is showing. It just completely didn't work for me. Anytime it would come on, I know what they're trying to do. It just would take me right out of it. So overall, as a film, I think it was a pretty good time. This is a movie that people who saw this movie when they were younger or caught up to it in the 80s are probably a bigger fan of than me. It feels like a very dated action thriller, but a film that definitely influenced other action thrillers of this type. It's just not my favorite film. It just felt a little too generic for me, but that's just looking back on a movie that's almost 50 years old. So you kind of got to give it a little bit of a pass for that, and I completely understand. For a movie that I just found in 2023, it just doesn't 100% work for me, but it's still a good movie. It's still a movie I'm going to revisit down the line, and if you haven't checked out Death Wish, I can definitely recommend it. But if you are interested in checking out Death Wish and you want to check out this Kino Lorber 4K, that's exactly what we're going to talk about right now. Well, here it is. This is the Kino Lorber 4K Blu-ray that just came out, and you got your standard Kino Lorber slipcover on there, which I always really love. Their slipcover design fits in with all their other slipcovers, and they're awesome because they're just kind of like the Criterion Collection where you can line them up on your shelf and you'll always know that this is a Kino Lorber 4K. I'm really glad that once they went to the 4K brand, they decided to find their own unique design that would definitely help it stick out on your shelf, because they used to just have the generic Blu-ray design, but when they started putting slipcovers on, they did a great job, and I really do love their slipcovers. So when you slide this off, underneath you get the same design and that awesome poster, which I do really love. Like, this poster could sell you on a movie. I think they did a great job on that. And when you pop it open, you get your standard Kino Lorber disc design. I am a big fan of individual disc design, and here we just get that standard Kino Lorber 4K and Blu-ray disc design. Now, it does fit in with what they always do, so I can't complain too much, but I'm definitely a sucker for some individual disc design, so I would have appreciated that. And now, all your extras, which are very bare bone, are on that Blu-ray disc. When I say bare bone, I mean they put like 10 trailers on here. There's an audio commentary track, one new interview, and I believe that's it. There's nothing else, and they're all on that Blu-ray disc. There's nothing on the 4K disc. And on that Blu-ray disc, when you go to choose audio, it'll just say 5.1 and 2.0. So I thought, okay, this must be that old Blu-ray from 2014 or 2015, I believe. And it's not, because those Blu-rays only had a mono track on it. This Blu-ray has the DTS HD 5.1 on it. So I was like, okay, let me see. This must be a compressed version of the 4K. So when I did my comparisons, I compared this Blu-ray to the 4K. And I gotta be honest, jumping from the Blu-ray to the 4K, it's pretty noticeable. I was pretty surprised because the 4K at points, especially in the early scenes, it can look a little rough. Now, this is a 1974 film, so this is all going to come down to source material. You know, Kino Lorber, from what I've seen, they never make mistakes on their transfers. They never have issues. It always looks the cleanest it could possibly look. That's really what they concentrate all their work on, is definitely in the visual department. I feel like they kind of slack a little bit on audio, and definitely they slack on the extras, but their visuals are always top shelf. Some of the best transfers that the 4K market has ever seen. It's just unfortunate that they kind of slack on some other parts that stop them from rising to like that Criterion level, or even Arrow and Vinegar Syndrome Now's level. So when we get here, it's some beautiful visuals. Now, like I said, the 4K was just a little rough in the beginning, and comparing it to the Blu-ray, I was like, oh wow, they actually did a great job jumping this to 4K, because it was very unsteady throughout the Blu-ray. Like, it's very grainy, which is to be expected, but just the way it was handling the colors. That scene I was saying earlier in the cemetery where it's snowing. Now the color, it just can't handle the white on the Blu-ray. It kind of like is going between like white and like pink. You could see the color kind of changing in the background a little bit. 4K completely steady throughout. You don't have that issue at all. And on top of that, the vibrance of the snow looks great. And because it's got Dolby Vision and HDR10 on it, it looks great. It's handling the colors great. It's handling the blacks, the deep blacks, at least in some of these scenes. Awesome. Now, there is an early scene in the movie where Charles Bronson's in his apartment alone, and the film is just kind of crackling. You can see the rips on it, like the little white marks popping up on the screen, and the black is gray, and it's clearly not handling that black level well, but it handles it so well in other scenes, it has to just come down to source material. This is a brand new 4K scan of an original camera negative, so they did the best they possibly could. I guess just some scenes, it was really hard to fix, but I still think they did a good job fixing those scenes from the Blu-ray, so it's a really big jump from the Blu-ray to the 4K. Now, it's a little less noticeable if you do it in the very opening scenes, pretty much until right after the murder/rape scene. I think it starts to get steady throughout where you never really see any like visual drops. Now, there are some in the early scenes you're going to be like, because like at the very beginning, I was not impressed with this 4K, but I was also going, okay, I understand. It's a source material thing. But then they really did steady it out. And again, it's still a pretty big jump from that Blu-ray to the 4K, which I think is just the same scan compressed. So again, that's just the power of HDR and Dolby Vision and the 4K format, because this film, from what I can tell, given I've never seen it before, was probably in pretty rough shape. You know, 1970s, got that dirt and grit all over it, and I really did think they did a great job cleaning it up and making it look the best it possibly could. It's not the most visually stunning movie I've ever seen, and it's definitely not the most visually stunning 4K I've ever seen, but I really am impressed with the work they did bringing this to the 4K format. I imagine it was probably really, really hard to get this film in the shape they wanted to get it in, and I think they did a good job. And like I said, this has 2 audio tracks on it. It's going to start in that DTS HD Master Audio 2.0 track, which is all that was used to be on the previous Blu-ray versions, but there is a DTS HD 5.1 that you could also choose from on here, and that's actually what I went with personally. I'll always go with the 5.1 if it's available. And I thought it was pretty good. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the score. It has that 1970s issue where the dialogue track is just a little bit too high compared to all the other sound effects throughout the movie. All the background noise, like nowadays, you know, the background noise and the mix, they all sound pretty even, so it sounds like the real world. Back then, I guess the mics they were using, the audio from the dialogue was just a little too high and it would be overwhelming. It almost sounds like what modern day ADR would sound like, but back then that's just kind of how the microphones were. They're not really doing ADR. It's just, you know, that's just how the audio was at the time, and it's probably really hard to clean up. And then the movie, this is an action movie, so there's a lot of guns going off, and I thought they did a pretty good job with it. I didn't think it was amazing. I didn't think it's one of the best tracks I've ever heard. It's a 1974 movie. I didn't expect them to clean it up that well, and it was just serviceable. I didn't have any issues with it. Nothing was overwhelmingly bad. Nothing just blew me away either. It was just pretty standard. You know, I never really thought too much about the audio other than the fact I just didn't enjoy the score. So I guess it's pretty good. So overall, can I recommend this Kino Lorber 4K? I think I can. I think this is very much in line with what Kino Lorber has done with all their 4Ks to this point. Very limited extras, a great visual transfer. Audio is just pretty standard packaging from Kino Lorber, which is still really good. So overall, I'm still going to give this a 7.5 out of 10. I really did enjoy my time with it. The movie itself is not my favorite, but I will go back and revisit it. I don't think I'll be checking out the sequels. They don't really sound like something that would be of interest to me, but I'm sure that a lot of people do love the sequels. I don't imagine that they'll get the Kino Lorber treatment, but hey, you never know. We've gotten some pretty crazy stuff on 4K while I'm still waiting for some of my favorite movies to come to 4K, so you never do know. But I definitely can recommend this. I definitely think you should check this out, and if you're a collector of Kino Lorber, at $27.99, that's not a bad price, and Kino Lorber pretty much never has their stuff drop on sale, so you're going to have to be, you know, paying attention if you want to. And we'll actually link our Amazon affiliate link down in the description below, because if Kino Lorber does have some sales, it's most likely going to be on Amazon, so throw that in your cart and keep an eye on it, and maybe you can get it for a lower price. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for being here with us for another episode of Let's Talk. As always, we really appreciate all your support. If you're unaware, we are on all podcast services now for our regular podcast show like Let's Talk Physical Media, and for our new show coming up called Half-Ass Movie Reviews. So definitely subscribe to that wherever you check out your podcast. And then if you want, you could also like this video, subscribe to the channel, and then if you really want to, you can go out and tell all your friends.